Welcome, everyone, to the final episode and world premiere of When the Shifts Change. I'm Lauren Anders-Brown, the film program producer for this year's Global Health Film Festival and the director of this series. This is going to be an open discussion that you and the audience can participate in by submitting questions via the Ask the Question box down below. There's also a couple polls you can take, and you can also chat to us in the chat box. I've known some of the contributors for some time, but some of them I'm meeting for the first time. Like, this is the first time I've met Syed. So I'm going to start off the discussion while some of the questions come in. And back in March and April, even though I wasn't in New York City, I knew what it was going through. And I also knew it was very difficult. I was absolutely amazed, though, that every night the city was cheering at 7 p.m. for essential workers, and it moved me and motivated me to finally turn the camera back home, even though I wasn't there. I knew it was a hard time, but one that had to be captured, and I wanted to see it through the eyes of the ones working through it. I knew it could come at some cost to the ones I asked to contribute. Either hospitals were requesting staff to be silent, or people were frozen in fear and just trying to get through the day. So my first big question to both Syed and Neiko here is, why did you personally agree to make this documentary with me?
I felt like it was a good cause. You know, I felt that people needed to know what was going on in New York City. It was a different atmosphere as soon as this hit, and then you saw differences in people's attitudes that you would not normally see in New Yorkers. People, even though they never held the door for anyone before, now they were definitely not holding it, and they were running away from you. It was eerie to go into Manhattan and see nobody in it, and a city that never sleeps. You're walking around and you're noticing these differences, and it's just amazing how many people just got disappeared almost, it seemed like, overnight. And before it even started to get real bad, you saw it progressing and progressing and progressing, and that's why I agreed to it.
And, Neiko, I've been so lucky to know you over the years. You've helped me move apartments in New York multiple times, and yes. And in other times whenever I need to ask, and I'm so grateful for that, but also for the work that you've been doing for the last few months. But Syed, I approached you on Twitter, so I'm just curious if you could tell me personally why you agreed to work on this with me.
So yeah, it was, at that time, like what Neiko's saying, I would be, in a silent city, going to a job that's building chaos. I just remember the day before. I actually remember the day before you had sent me a message. I had parked my car in the middle of First Avenue, gotten out in the middle of First Avenue, and stood there, and there was nothing on the road. There was not a person there. There was no cars coming. There was no bus coming. And if anyone's been to New York City, to stand on First Avenue anywhere in New York City and stand in the middle of the road with nothing happening is one of those feelings that you never forget. And it was like a dystopian film, it was like a noir dystopian film. And when you asked me to film, help film a documentary, I think, to be absolutely honest, it felt like another chapter in this dystopian film that, like, on top of it, there's nobody around, but somebody's asked me to film something for it, which is like, wow, there is like some sign of life going on still, that somebody's making something in this time. And at that time, I couldn't even imagine somebody making anything, because my job was like everybody, being freaked out about what's happening. And nobody felt very creative then. So it really stood out that you asked for us to participate in this. So that's why for me it was like a no-brainer to say yes to it.
And I think this series is forever, indebted to you for doing that. I know it wasn't easy. I know there were a lot of challenges, and like you said, it was such a surreal time. I really didn't want to add on more work, but I was also aware of how important those moments were to capture, especially for, New Yorkers, as you said, Neiko, because I think we're a very different kind of breed. I know that a lot of the Shift Change recordings were inspirational to some of the people that ended up filming them. Brad, who couldn't be with us today, he ended up going on to doing an entire selfie video campaign for Feed America. And I believe he raised over $15,000 with just like turning on his camera every day, to people and encouraging them in different ways and giving them incentives to kind of donate. And so whether it be work life or personal life, or, feel free to talk about the bigger issues New York or the US has had and has changed. I'd love to hear what has changed for you since the filming. Neiko, do you want to start?
Go ahead.
Since the filming has ended, since the last time we spoke, I feel like everybody's guard kind of has gone down. Not everybody's as cautious as they once were, and that's probably contributing to all the numbers that are rising now. I know the traffic in New York City is back to normal. You see everyone out and about. So even though you see that, I do also see that everybody is trying to take the precautions as much as they can. People are wearing their masks. You can't go into a store without your mask now. Everywhere you're going, yes, people do say, put your mask on, do this and that, and you know how New Yorkers are, and they have their attitude, and they look at you a little funny, but it as it was, they just, everybody's got a little, it goes away soon, so things turn to normal, whatever the new normal might be, but that's what I've taken away from it and seen lately.
And for you, Syed, what's changed since you were, retraining and setting up that whole new program?
As these days we're starting to talk again about like a re-lockdown. We're kind of on the cusp of a big rise. So in the back of my head, I'm always thinking that this time that we filmed is, could be right around the corner again. It's not that unimaginable that it could happen again. But interestingly, what I found is that this has gone through like a series of phases. And Thanksgiving was the most recent example that I can think of. The awkwardness of everything around this situation is nonstop. My wife wanted to go chill with her parents that she hasn't seen that often since March. And I felt weird doing that. They're older and I don't want to expose anyone to anything. So, I dropped her off at her parents because if she was so committed to it, and I dropped her off and I came home and I had like a burger by myself in the apartment. So that kind of, we all have these stories, I think, and we're kind of like connected by them. Like it's no other time where I could tell this story and everybody would understand. Normally people would be like, "What's wrong with you?" You drop. But I think we all kind of know, we get it. We have a lot of flexibility now for being weird. So.
That is true, especially when nothing is normal. I guess there are no rules,
Right.
Neiko, I wanted to bring up something that we had discussed a little bit earlier last week, which I looked up a report from the Independent Budget Office, and it showed that the Department of Sanitation in New York handles tons of garbage per day, and about 12,000 tons to be exact. But that's only half the cities, which includes institutional and residential waste and not commercial waste, which is a lot of what you deal with. Do you still feel that fear that you talked about in the series? And if so, how do you manage it?
Yeah, there are some residential areas that we do, and I was actually out on the truck doing those residential areas. And at the beginning, the fear was a lot higher because we didn't exactly know what could be, I guess, contagious, or what you could touch and what you couldn't touch. Now that we're learning more and more and we're taking the precautions, it's definitely a different attitude towards it. I'm still noticing things, like I said, with the masks, the gloves, people throwing them on the grounds and stuff, and we do pick them up in the neighborhoods we're in. It's it's definitely something different, but people have it's a different atmosphere. It's not as bad as it was from the knowledge we have now.
I'm going to take one of the questions is for the cast. What is it like recording those testimonials? Was it cathartic or painful? And have you revisited any of those videos in the last 6 months? Syed, would you like to start?
Yeah, I thought it was super awkward and weird in the beginning. The first one I was making, you know, I remember I did like 20 takes for the first one because, you know, I was sitting in front of an ice cream store. I'm like walking in the middle of the road. I'm walking in front of my garage, and the only like 8 people who were out in Brooklyn would like stare at me, you know, as if I'm like a news reporter or something else. But I clearly wasn't. Like I was not any of those things. It was very awkward. And at some point, I have to admit, Lauren, I was like, oh man, I don't know if this is for me, you know, to like sit and talk about what's going on.
I think Neiko had that moment many times.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was like a Dear Diary to myself. And then I kind of felt like, you know, but the funniest thing happened is like somewhere along the way, like I think it was the second or third day, I would be at work and I'd be like, it was actually a part of my schedule that like at some point I was like, okay, I'm going to get out of work now. You know, I'd plan everything and I'd be like, okay, I'm going to record the video here. And I think that's when it occurred to me that like it was cathartic in that way, and that it was letting me say what I wanted to say, because I couldn't tell my family everything. I didn't want to expose them to all of my trauma from COVID stuff. So, you know, it was very cathartic for me, actually.
So, Neiko, did you find it to be helpful as part of your dealing with the pandemic to record these yourself? And have you looked at any of the videos you sent me since then? Oh, Neiko.
What happened? I'm still here?
Yep, you're still here. Go ahead.
So at the beginning, I feel like when I look at the beginning videos, there was the fear in not knowing exactly everything that was going on, whereas the videos progressed, you noticed that my attitude would change, and I could see that. I know that the virus is still around and we're still all around it and the fear is still there, but the knowledge we have is different. So when I go back to look at the beginning videos, yeah, it definitely shows the reflection of how much fear was in the city and what it changed, and how everybody's lives just overnight went to something completely different.
Yeah, I mean, I think the world changed in what felt like 24 hours, really.
Yeah.
Neiko, you know, when Syed described the scene in this discussion earlier about being on First Avenue and not having a single like car or person, you know, that you know, almost ran them over, which almost never happens in New York, as we know.
Yeah.
But like always remembering that moment, and kind of, do you have a moment like that you remember from back in March and April that just really, you'll never forget visually, that kind of brings you back to that place?
Yeah, it's more at the beginning of May when I went into Harlem and I went down 125th Street, and I remember
Oh, Neiko, I'm so sorry. Can you start back when you were saying you went into Harlem at 125th Street? I lost you right after that.
Yeah. So back in the beginning of May, I went into Harlem at 125th Street, and my memories of going in there from a year prior were storefronts, people walking in the middle of the street, jaywalkers, everything. And I drove in there, and I pulled over the truck, and there was not a soul in sight. You could stand in the middle of the street, something as busy as that street, going in from the Triborough Bridge into Manhattan, where everybody goes in. You didn't see a soul. And it was kind of eerie to see something like that. And storefronts closed over the few months that was there. You had big realtors that were all over the place, that storefronts and everything. And now these buildings are abandoned almost. And it's eerie. One's left there.
And this is for both of you. Do you feel that those surreal visuals and the time in lockdown has impacted other New Yorkers, either those who were essential workers like yourselves or those who were actually locked down? And how do you think that, how have they been impacted? Now we've been able to kind of see people at some point and hear a bit more than where we were back in March and April. Do you think that that's kind of a lasting memory that has had, either whether it be a positive or negative, most likely negative impact, I'd say, or even a traumatic impact? Syed, do you mind starting with that, and then hopefully we'll get Neiko back?
For us, in the hospital, it's been one of those things that there's a huge amount of fatigue. And, it's changed a little bit with this introduction of the vaccine lately. But before the vaccine stuff was coming out, there was this concept that we might just be like this for a long, long amount of time. And I think that the stress level has gone down only because I think there's some amount of human nature that can't possibly be at high stress for so long. Like, you end up adapting and then trying something new. So people kind of had, it almost became a joke, right? Like, I know that sounds like terrible, but at some point you have to joke about it, that like, like you just joke, like the answer to anything could be coronavirus. And, that's kind of like the joke for us. And being in the hospital every day, we have to show our phones that we're clear to come into work, and like you feel like you're going straight into like a military kind of setup where you're just geared for like warfare. So I think there's a general amount of fatigue about it all, and people have been through varying degrees of problems, like every single person who works in a hospital. So there's just a lot of trauma that's happened, I think, within a building like that.
Glad to have you back, Neiko, and thank you for that, Syed. Neiko, I was just curious if you think that if those visuals, if they've kind of left an imprint on you, or anyone else, with what they've experienced from some of the challenges due to COVID that you know of.
Experience that I hope to never see again. I mean, ever since I was a kid, you would always think of New York City as this city that is just so congested and stuff. And to see visuals like that, or even the outer boroughs, Brooklyn, Queens, I mean, it was surreal, the emptiness and not seeing anyone. And it's just like, it's almost like a scene from a movie you think of, and it replays in your head. And I hope to never see something like that again. But, it's definitely left an imprint on me of something that I've never seen my whole life. And it's something that I don't think most people have seen. That's definitely what I've taken away.
Absolutely. We have a question from a fellow New Yorker, Sarah, who's asking for Neiko and Syed. There's so much about the new normal we hope is short-term, but it has also highlighted major system-wide flaws of pre-COVID life. What is one normal part of your working world you look forward to returning, and what is something you hope doesn't come back? Neiko, let's start with you.
You know what I miss? I miss actually greeting people and seeing people and shaking their hands now. That's definitely a no-no. Everybody doesn't want to touch anything and stuff. And I see people and customers that I haven't seen in a while, and you go to do what you normally would do and give someone a handshake and stuff, and it's changed. It's a head nod or a fist bump or any of those things. It's those things I would like to return to eventually, and hopefully it does. I mean, other than that, there's not much other than that.
And what do you? Okay, so you want handshaking to return, and is there anything that you don't want to come back, or anything that you want to keep of your current work regime?
I like the cleanliness that we've been upkeeping. Everybody's aware of what's going on. Before, I guess, no one really paid attention to any of this stuff, the sanitizing, this and that. I mean, everywhere you go now, you walk in, you see a Purell station or a sanitizing station, and this is the new normal. Every time you walk in, wear your mask, wash your hands. You already know, and I notice everybody's taking those precautions, and they're doing it so many times a day. That I do like, and hopefully that would contain any other kind of outbreak or any other kind of viruses that could happen.
And Syed, what do you want to keep and what do you want to come back?
So I think one of the things that it's very odd to really love some part of this time, but there is something that I do like a lot. And I think that Thanksgiving story I told you is kind of the basis of this. I like the fact that people had to deal with something unexpected with flexibility and sort of mold into something a little new. And I feel that our lives are very comforted in normal times where you go day to day and you kind of do a routine and nothing affects you that much unless you have a situation. But I feel like every day was kind of volatile and it made people feel a little bit more urgent and in the moment. And I don't want that to be, entirely the way we live, but I think some aspect of that, I think that people should go back to a little bit, that we don't get so comfortable with the usual all the time. One of the things that I, this was seen in the hospital, for example, like when we had to do something very quickly, it was like done at lightning speed, like without all the bureaucracy and the negotiations and stuff. People just made decisions and they like just lived for that, which I think is amazing. And the other part of this question is something that we have that I don't want to.
So you want the bureaucracy to go,
right.
But
right.
What do you want to keep?
What do I want to keep? Well, I want to keep that flexibility that we have, and so I want the bureaucracy and the emphasis on money and the emphasis on business and the emphasis on, corporate stuff to go away. I want our personal flexibility, our social flexibility, our ability to be challenged a little bit without, having it drown us to stay. I guess they're intertwined.
Those are some really good points. I'm just curious, since I never really got to ask you this and you were so in the thick of it at the time, did you enjoy retraining and setting up the program that you did?
Oh yeah, it was strange because it was very stressful, but at the same time, when you get to go do something that you made a choice not to do earlier in your life. So I made a choice in my life earlier not to be involved in like ICU care and intensive care. So right. I had a chance to kind of go back to it, not under the terms that I wanted to, but it's kind of an interesting experience to revisit your past and try something again for a second time. So yeah, it was very interesting.
And do you think you're going to retrain as a souffle chef next?
Yeah. Unpredictable. We don't know what's coming next. We might need souffles to save the world at some point. So.
We do, just not on barbecues.
Right.
So let's talk a little bit about the medical changes that have happened in New York since we were filming. So because we're just starting to see the second wave, no matter where you are in the world, I think. And I have some numbers from December 2nd that there were in New York City, there were 203,440 tests reported. 9,855 were positive, which is 4.84% of the total. Hospitalizations were at 4,063, and there were 61 COVID fatalities on that day, or the day before, so just December 1st. What differences do you see now compared to March and April in how the frontline medical staff are managing? And I'll let you get started with that question, then I have a follow-up to that.
Yeah, it's different. First of all, it's totally expected. So I think all of us knew that there was going to be a second wave. We all knew. And I think we all came to grips with this in like June. So we've been waiting since then. And I remember there'd be times when when the protests happened, we were worried that this could trigger a second wave. When there was some, event like Labor Day or some holiday, we were worried that could trigger an event. But Thanksgiving is going to be the one that probably actually does it because way too many people traveled and way too many people went around. And so we were totally ready. And in our hospital, we get constant updates, like a few times a week, about the latest things. And, like you, I keep track of those numbers and I'm always watching them. And yeah, it's much more gradual this time. So if you remember the first time, if you look at the chart, you can see it just went straight up, like in a spike. And right now it's gradual, and we know it's coming, and it's slowly kind of rising. And, a lot of, the people who are at most at risk already know kind of the drill of what to do and how to stay out of, themselves getting in trouble. So I think there are some major differences. It's going to be softer. My impression is it's going to be softer, but it's still going to be, a major issue. And I would hope that hospitals are more ready with supplies and people and scheduling, and they've kind of figured out a lot of these things that they didn't have figured out the first time around. So,
yeah, I mean, knowledge is huge in this instance, I think, for the second wave, for both the frontline medical staff and for, the population in general.
Yeah.
Do you think ICU nurses like Tom might need to separate from their families again?
This is such a difficult thing. And I know that many hospitals provide kind of housing for people who are working in really high risk areas, or they try to. I myself, for example, never did separate from my family. I used to come home, do the washing, like change clothes, et cetera, et cetera. But I was never, like, an ICU nurse is constantly in that realm. I was not constantly in that realm ever. So it's possible. It's possible. I mean, I guess it depends on so many things, right? Like, who's in the house with you? Have they been exposed? Are they at risk? What kind of risk? And,
So this brings me to one of the questions, and also to something else I wanted to bring up, which is some of the contributors who aren't with us on this panel. Everyone you saw from the series who isn't currently with us here is actually working. Eric is driving a subway.
Wow.
Brad has to do overtime with the holidays and delivering all of our mail and presents for Christmas. Ali's working night shifts, and Carlos is just about to join us very soon because he's just finishing his shift. But there are other contributors who were even unseen in this series, the support systems for each one of you. Tom talked about his role that his wife, who I hope is still in the audience, played in providing for his children. And I know you mentioned your wife as well. And I'm just curious, and that kind of goes to the question that the audience asked, to talk about the gender imbalance. I always do my best to try and have as much of a balanced amount of men and women in front of the camera, but it just wasn't possible for me in the short period of time that we had. And also just the gender of people that were doing some of these jobs, unfortunately. And also, like, the fact that essentially a lot of women had to take on bigger caring roles. And so I'm curious what role your support network played in allowing you to continue your essential work, but also how they impacted you doing your work. Syed.
Yeah, first of all of you guys working, I love all of the people in the video. So I think it's, it's the fact that they're all working is not surprising to me. The fact that I'm sitting, the fact that I'm sitting under a bunk bed right now recording this is not surprising to me either. My wife, she's a very professional person. She, works at a major New York newspaper. She always took the subway to work, into Times Square, and I, her job was every day just as busy as my job before coronavirus happened. She hasn't been to her work since March, basically since April. And our kids' school, as anyone with kids on here knows, it's been on and off, mostly off. It comes back on, and we have a 5-year-old son. So 5-year-old children are crazy. They're always running, they're breaking stuff, they're screaming, they need something, they need to eat something. It's like a nonstop thing. So during the times of COVID, like when I filmed this, I was working a long schedule from morning till late at night. And she was basically, here alone with some help on and off. It was not easy. It was actually a big source of stress on me to worry about them as well. Like that, she's got to do this by herself, and I got to get home at some point. And but she understood. She understood because this was the reason why she was at home, right? So she understood the gravity of it. And I think I'm pretty sure all the spouses or partners or boyfriends and girlfriends or whatever, everybody knows that somebody who was working in this time was under a lot of stress, and a lot of us didn't have a choice, either by calling or by occupation. And I think that support was strong in the sense that it didn't pile on to us. I didn't feel like I was being piled on for the moment, and that's basically like all you can do in that time when everybody's already feeling stressed. So
absolutely. I mean, I think that was definitely apparent to me, to friends and colleagues and other essential workers that I knew that had families, was that the sacrifices that had to be made, and how you didn't really have a choice at times who took care of the kids and who didn't. And I think we're still going to wait to see the impact of that in years to come. I'm going to start this question because I know Carlos is going to hopefully join us halfway through, because he is about to come on stage. But Carlos talked a lot about some of the racial issues, as did Eric, actually. And you talked about protests, and like you just mentioned now, but although not related to some of the racial issues that have been coming out of this pandemic. But how do you feel about the protests of people gathering in close proximity during the pandemic in relation to your work? Do you feel like it invalidates your work, or is this just such a different systemic issue that it's kind of separate to the pandemic?
Wow, I think it's such a complex issue, because for me the protests, my personal opinion is I felt they were totally justified and needed, and it was a public health issue in itself inside of that. Because I see that as a public health issue as well.
Absolutely.
And the second side of me is like, yeah, go do all that, but just don't be too, try to stay a little bit farther apart. And so it was like, I supported the whole idea. It's just, I didn't want people to get sick from it. And that was protesting something bad, and having something worse happen to you on the side, totally different, is something I didn't want. So yes, I was scared about that time, but I'm glad that, as far as I know, it wasn't a huge cause of any public health problem for the pandemic.
Yeah, and I mean, these issues are still going to have to carry on, even though we're in a pandemic, or else we end up falling backwards. And
exactly.
I think it's been pretty obvious that we're already behind where we should be when it comes to equality in many senses.
Totally.
And New York isn't absolved from that, just because it might consider itself a different kind of city.
Yeah.
So while hopefully Carlos gets to join us, there was something there. I think let me just check to see if there's a question I want to get to before I get to this point. Okay, so Ed has asked, how do you feel New York is going to be different in the future? And how do you think New Yorkers have been changed by this?
Wow. So first of all, the one thing that's shocking me, and I only came to grips with this in the last month or two, is that a lot of people have moved out of New York. People we know, I didn't even know some people have moved. Like, we had some friends in the neighborhood, their kids went to our school, and I saw Facebook photos of them posting from a house somewhere in New Jersey. I was like, you guys moved from the neighborhood? And they're like, yeah, we moved in August. Like, like, I didn't even pay attention. I was like, oh, it's strong. So people have moved. A lot of young families have moved. A lot of it's very odd to me, as somebody I was shopping for a place, to buy a place before this started. And nothing was on the market during the coronavirus times, and now things are on the market super cheap because nobody's buying anything. And I think that New York is going to change because of this, but I don't want to sound too crude, but I sort of feel the people who kind of didn't want to be here in the first place are the ones who kind of bolted immediately. They kind of took off, and the ones who love it for other reasons that are much deeper are the ones who are like, no, this is my place, so I'm sticking around. So I think it's going to change a lot, and I think the way restaurants are run, the way shops are run, the way we're more flexible in different ways. Like, I think the flexibility of New York, which was always pretty flexible, but I think it's going to change in a different way. It's going to be flexible in a different way.
Absolutely. And I think, talking about the changes that are going to happen brings me to my next question. It was announced by the governor of New York, Andrew Cuomo, the one who had quoted Churchill at the end of the documentary, if you remember, that New York's first delivery of the Pfizer vaccine will be enough for 170,000 New Yorkers. And he said, we expect, if all safety and efficiency approvals are granted, to receive these doses on December 15th. Now, the New York City population is 8.3, which is just slightly less than London. So in a city like New York, where people can have sharp elbows even to get on a subway, how do you see the vaccine being distributed, and how do you feel they should be distributed?
I do think there are two populations that should get vaccinated first. I think, and I don't know which order, but I think it should be nursing homes and elderly, or people with severe chronic illnesses, or people on chemotherapy, things that make people very, very susceptible to this. And not just because I'm a healthcare worker, but I think healthcare workers have to have the vaccine, because we are constantly in packed elevators in a hospital. Like, genuinely, like, all this time you guys may have ridden some elevators and had people be like, oh, I'll wait for the next one. We have packed elevators every time going into, like, for this whole time since March, we've had packed elevators. So we haven't changed any of that. And I do think for that reason alone, and the fact that, like, if somebody sick comes, I think that we're the ones who have to deal with them. So I do think healthcare workers should be vaccinated. Anyone who works with, even like nursing home staff and things like that, anyone who has to deal with people from the most at-risk populations. But that's my opinion. Others may disagree.
So, Carlos, I think you're joining us from literally just finishing your working shift in the prep room, right?
Yep.
Amazing. Thank you so much for persevering and being a part of this, and for being a part of the documentary, honestly.
It was amazing. Thank you for having me.
Of course. So we were just talking about vaccines, and being a New Yorker and how it's going to change New Yorkers. So, I have two questions for you to catch you up. And so one is, how do you see the vaccines being distributed, and who do you think should get them first? And then how's New York going to change, and New Yorkers going to change from this, just in your opinion?
I mean, I personally haven't seen anything coming yet, but honestly, I think the politicians should get the vaccines first, just to test them out, because, it's easy. I get it that they want the healthcare workers to get the vaccines first because they are on the front lines, and they're dealing with this, on a daily basis. But we don't know, because we don't know what the side effects of this vaccine is going to be, or how it's going to react. We may not see anything a week from now, or maybe 6 months down the line. There may or may not be any type of severe side effects for it. So, obviously with the rush to push these out, hopefully there's, no errors being made on that front.
And then Ed had asked a question, which I'm going to ask you as well, which was, how do you feel New York is going to be different in the future? And how do you think New Yorkers have been changed by this?
Well, the one thing is, New Yorkers have always been resilient, especially during this pandemic. Like I was saying, during the initial process, most people fear what they don't understand. So once we get a better understanding of what this virus is and what it does, people start to be a little bit more open-minded, and changing for the better, and enough with the bigotry and the pointing fingers, or where this came from, and this and that. And so once that has settled, everything will change for the better.
Yeah, I mean, that's what we can hope for. And that actually brings me to my last question, for both of you. What did you want people to take away from this documentary? So
I think, no, not that I think, but I know people can see the different viewpoints of what frontline workers deal with on a daily basis. And everybody goes through things differently, some more than others. And I have tremendous respect for the nurses and the doctors and the first responders in general, who are constantly dealing with this, with this invisible enemy. And God knows, they're very resilient, and much respect to what they do.
But also to you too. I hope you'd want people to take that away too, because I think the point is everyone has a role to play, and the front line isn't just in hospitals. It's I think it's a bit further than we all understood before this. Yeah,
I mean, it's we're there. We're making sure that all the residents are safe. If they need anything, we're always a phone call away, whether it's for packages or, when the mail comes, or food deliveries. And, when this whole thing started initially, everybody had that fear, okay, well, just leave everything at the front, we'll pick it up, or if they can, just leave it at the front door, we'll get it. And even though we're seeing less and less of that now, there's still some residents who still adhere to those precautions. And that's perfectly fine. We all get it. And as not only me, but also my colleagues, as long as we have the proper protection, there's nothing we can't do.
Absolutely. Syed, what did you want people to take away from this?
So one of the interesting things to me is that whenever we hear about people who are doing stuff like this in the news, like, on any of the news channels, it's got to be some news-tastic story, about like something extraordinary that, has to be pushed by the news. I know this for a fact because we had news people coming into the hospital looking for little stories, and they cherry pick out, they want something with like blood and guts and like, or like heavy emotion all the time. What I love about this kind of a documentary is that we may all know people who work in the different professions that everybody in the documentary is in, but we may not too. And I got to kind of feel like I've got a friend who works in sanitation, or I've got like a friend who works on the subway, or, and it's like having a FaceTime with that person to like hear their version of the story. And I think that's super cool. And I, as somebody who recorded it, but also watched it to see, what everybody was saying, it kind of, you feel that kind of continuity day to day. That's something that a CNN 8-minute gimmicky, thing, not to deride the people who are on CNN, like it's fine. I'm happy for you. But, it doesn't have that continuity of living. It's not natural the way that the news shows it. This is like real stuff that, it's how you get to know people. This is how a human connection is formed, by continuity. So this has like a mini continuity.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Syed. And, that gets me to, there were some questions that were put in the box. I'm going to answer them in the chat in the after party that's to come. And I really would just want to thank you both so much for being a part of this documentary series with me. It literally couldn't have been made without you and without your support networks. And I know I couldn't have been more inspired to make it through all the footage that you guys sent me without my support network, which is one of them being my father, who you may have met before, Carlos, who gave me my start as a filmmaker, and my partner, Ed, who is also a doctor and an essential worker during the same months while the documentary was filmed. And I'm sure, Carlos, you can also attest that there's nothing like the support of our four-legged friends. So, my dog definitely gets a shout out there as well. I really also just want to very quickly thank my producer, Jess, who couldn't be with us today because she's working as well as a code compliance officer on set, and especially Jerry McHugh, the founder, director, and visionary of the Global Health Film, who believed in this idea from the start and gave me a platform to make it all possible. And the audience, because you're the reason I'm inspired as a filmmaker and want to make films that make a difference. So thank you so much for attending this final screening, but the evening is not over yet. no film festival is complete without a party. So keep your screens right where they are. And in a couple minutes, the virtual party hosted by the essential workers from When the Shifts Change is going to bring you a little bit of New York from wherever you are in the world. So go grab yourself a drink or your dance shoes or both. And we'll see you right back here at the screen in a couple minutes. Thank you both again so much, Carlos and Syed, for joining us.
Oh,
Thank you for having
so
us.
much. Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.